Welcome to the S&W The Pulse podcast, the sports and media show which covers everything from insurance to image rights. I'm Pete Fairchild, tax partner and head of the sports, media and entertainment team at Smith and Williamson. And joining me for each episode is of course our dear friend Eddie Dewar, who is a former professional footballer and advisor now to sports people generally. Ed, hello.
Hi.
And joining me today is Mo Pasricha, an associate from Mackrell's law firm. Good afternoon, Mo.
Hi, Pete.
And in today's episode, we will be discussing legal matters and really having a bit of a drill down into those areas involving players' contracts and seeking the right advice, right input, and defending oneself from issues that might arise when you're driving. So to set the scene in terms of the thrust of today's podcast being about all things sort of legal, do you want to just tell us a little bit about your firm in terms of the areas that you look after, sorts of clients that you deal with?
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Pete. Thank you for having us. Good to see you, Ed.
You too.
We are a full-service law firm based in central London, and we pretty much cover every area of law that an individual or a company or corporate requires. We've got different sector experiences, one of which is sports entertainment, a team which I head and lead, and we've also got a big international network which reaches about 5,000 lawyers worldwide. Generally, most of our clients require more than one colleagues of mine's experience or expertise, so whether that's Manisha's expertise in the family law team or my expertise in the sports team, and they generally tend to transcend throughout the department. So that's where we are as a firm. We've been around a fairly long time, since 1840. And
you look pretty good.
No, I know, yeah. I mean, I was going to say some things about some of the existing partners there, but I'll probably stop there.
I wouldn't.
And then, but obviously we've worked well with a number of other professional advisors too, such as LP.
Cool. Well, we thought we would try and break down this particular podcast into a couple of distinct areas, one of which, Mo, will sort of perhaps involve you first of all, if we may, which is on sort of contractual matters.
Yes.
And whilst, and I talk to you as a tax practitioner, some of the legal stuff can be a little bit dry, shall we say.
Yes.
I think it's very important that we do emphasise the importance of having a proper and thorough tax and legal review of contracts before pen is put to paper and they sort of become binding, as it were. Do you just want to sort of open that up, because I've got some examples that I can sort of run through, I'm sure you have as well,
yeah, sure.
Just to highlight where things can go quite badly wrong quite quick.
Yeah. I think we've both dealt with issues with players signing contracts which essentially have not been reviewed by a legal or tax advisor. And the importance of setting up contracts correctly predominantly comes from the fact that English law allows you to set up a contract verbally. There are things that you may agree as an athlete with your agent or your club that may not be in the contract that you end up signing, or you thought was in the contract that you were signing. The importance of having someone from a legal or financial background looking at these things really comes down to, there's a couple of principles in English law that I think are worthwhile setting out at the beginning, a couple of ideas that we should think about. Essentially, English law looks at making sure that any contract or contractual terms that you have in place should be used in their natural and ordinary meaning. So for plain English, it's about you and I both being able to explain the contractual provision to our grandmothers, essentially. Can we explain it? And if it's not that easily explainable, or it's not clear, that there's uncertainty.
Sure.
We've seen lots of issues with this previously. There's two other key points before we move into some examples. So entire agreement clauses. So in these contracts, you normally have an entire agreement clause, and for the uninitiated, it's pretty much saying that everything that's in this contract is what we've agreed. And there's lots of conversations that agents have with players have with clubs, and vice versa, where they'll agree lots of things, and they think it's in the agreement. And because you've got an entire agreement clause in there, if it's not in there, then it's not part of the deal.
Sure.
And it comes to much of a shock and surprise, as many of us have come across before, when you've seen players and agents who go, well, I thought it was in there, and I thought we agreed this. And when it's signed and done, this one provision has the ability to take out all those months of negotiations and hard work.
Yeah.
The other point really is that in English law you have lots of implied terms, and it's important to make sure that we don't imply something inadvertently in contracts. So setting up these contracts correctly is of paramount importance, actually. And that's where we get a lot of issues, unfortunately, where they haven't been reviewed, and either there's not clear terms or not everything's been put into the agreement as we thought it would be. So that's kind of setting the basis for what we're seeing at the moment.
Fantastic. So the latest case that you can talk about involved what precisely? I mean, where did the player, his agent, perhaps believe they were? Yeah. Where was reality?
So one of the latest cases I've been working on has been revolved around players' bonuses. So the player in question believed he was entitled to a bonus because the club had qualified for a European competition.
Right.
The agent believed the player was entitled to a bonus because the club had qualified for a European competition. And it was very much not only the belief of this one player, but it was a belief of 5 or 6 of his teammates that they'd all entitled to a bonus.
Right.
And very quickly I realised no bonus was forthcoming, and they kind of raised some questions, and they all raised questions with their various agents, until we were sent a copy of the agreement that the player had signed with the club. And the bonus itself was entirely discretionary and conditional on a number of different conditions, i.e. how many games had that particular player been involved with in that particular season that contributed to qualification for that particular European competition. And they can, as you'll know, Ed and Pete, get as complicated as that. And so that kind of highlights, if it had been thrown in front of myself or Pete or even someone who Ed, you've seen these deals before, these are the things to kind of pick up on, and we would have picked it up straight away before it had been signed and entered into. And this particular bonus, which he hedged quite a bit of money on, unfortunately, will come on to lots of issues with players and what they do with their money.
So
mentally spent the money. So we're in a bit of an issue. Maybe.
And in that scenario, Ed, if you was looking after a player whose earth had just been shattered in this situation, how do you pick them up again? What's their mental state like?
Well, in a word, difficult, very hard, okay? Because, I just want to go back to the player's thoughts before, on why he felt that he was entitled to this. From a club's point of view, what normally tends to happen is that for a young player coming through into the first team, he will feel, now I'm playing in the first team with senior players, I will be entitled to, we win on a Saturday, we share 3 points, we lose on Saturday, we get the same points, we draw on Saturday, we get the same points. But what he doesn't understand, whether it's through naivety of his agent, or maybe some players have just got mum and dad doing it for them, which is another story in itself, and I would like to touch on that a little bit later with you guys. What a player don't understand is that with football clubs, every single player's contract will be different from the person you sit next to in the change room. So there's no blanket contract to say, well, Pete, if you are in the first team, you are going to earn the same as your teammate. Until you negotiate that, and if you have a good agent that is able to negotiate them terms and conditions for you, then you will find yourself in a good position where if you do enter into a European game, if you do make your first team appearance, if you do score, if you play X amount of minutes that season, it would all trigger different clauses in your contract. So for example, we won't put any names to it, but we had a kid yesterday that, a young player that was on the bench for a Premier League side, and for him getting onto the bench, he received a bonus. Okay, if he would have gotten to the pitch at a particular time, he would have received another bonus. But that's all been negotiated months and months and months ahead of time for this particular reason. And what football clubs do, and they don't do, and what they don't tell you about, is almost like in a small print. Right? So this is where you guys come into it. You see the small print quite often. I'll say more often than not, So what a football club will do is they will turn around and say, we are going to reward you with a new deal, a new contract, because you're now in the first team. What they don't tell you is that you have to have your agent come and negotiate your terms and conditions. That's why when you see in the transfer season, the transfer time, when you hear deals are falling through because of personal terms, what that means in real language and in, to be able to explain it to your grandmother, Mo, is the player and his agent and the club could not agree on a deal. So what I want the club to pay me and what the club feel that they should pay me is two different things. So if we don't meet in that middle ground or find that space where everybody around the table is happy, then that's where that term comes from. The deal fell through because we couldn't agree personal terms. So to answer that question, your boy that got into the squad sitting there thinking, okay, now we're in Europe, we're going to be making a lot of money, mentally spending his bonuses. What he didn't realise was that his contract hadn't been negotiated to that effect. So he's now sitting in a room with players that he's probably run the same amount of miles, putting a shift with them, but his teammate on his left and his right are earning different bonuses compared to him. So therefore, if you don't have the agent that has that foresight, or you don't have the right team around you, you know, in you guys' case, the right lawyers around you, you'll find yourself in this kind of situation more often than not. And don't forget, it's not in the club's position to give you more money. They will not do that. That's why you see clubs will be around for hundreds of years and the player's career is only for 10 years, because they have to keep themselves around for a long, long time. And that's how they keep themselves existing and keep themselves going, because they protect their asset, which is the amount of money that they pay the athlete, if you like. So going back to that, it's very important that a player would have their own individual contracts agreed to at the beginning. Yeah.
The devil's in the detail, isn't it? A case that we saw recently involved a player who was going to get a performance bonus every time he took to the field of play, which was lovely.
Yes.
But then there was a little sub-clause that said you had to be on the field of play at the final whistle to be awarded that particular bonus.
Correct.
So of course what happens, he gets subbed in the 89th minute.
Yes.
Having played a stormer during the game itself, no bonus.
There you go.
And the same player, who's a striker, had a goal scoring bonus inserted into the contract. Again, sub-clause says that you could have a barnstorming start to the season and score a hat-trick when the season starts in August, go through September, October, November, the rest of the season, in fact, smashing it out of the park. The little sub-clause says you won't get your goal scoring bonus until the season end.
Yeah.
So you've got this time lag between actually putting in the shift
so when you
and actually getting the reward for it.
Yeah.
By which time his enthusiasm,
it's diminished somewhat,
completely evaporated.
Yeah.
So having that review,
it's
so important.
I mean, we see, those kind of the level of complexity now in some of these agreements, to the point how many minutes. What does it all comes really down to the definitions? What is defined as entering the field of play? We're getting the level of complexity of some of these contracts is at the top end when it comes to just general, looking from a commercial and employment angle. And the problem is the message that's being communicated sometimes. I think that's an issue that we sometimes find, that the player believes I'm entitled to X, Y, Z bonuses, but either it hasn't been explained to him properly that these are all conditional on different things, and that's the deal that's coming from the club, or the agent hasn't been able to effectively negotiate it to a position whereby the bonuses should be entitled at a much earlier stage, or the field of play should be defined as if you get onto the field as opposed to playing the full 90 minutes. And we see that quite a lot, actually.
Yeah, I think it's very dangerous. I think it's very, very dangerous when you enter into a contract where it will be based on if you play X amount of minutes. Because, like you said, Pete, if you've got a youngster, or if you have a player, just say if you have a player or an athlete who comes on that pitch and scores a goal that wins you the Premier League, the Champions League, the FA Cup, surely that player should be rewarded. Now, are you going to say we're going to take that bonus away from that player because he did not finish the game? Or are we going to look at the bigger picture and say, because of this young player, we won the FA Cup? So, for me, when I enter into these conversations and these types of negotiations with clubs, like you said, Mo, the bigger the club is, the more intricate the deal is. So, it has to be a two-way thing. The club have to understand that they have an asset on their hands, and the player also has to understand that he has to work in order to get them bonuses. But my job will be to say, okay, well, you're going to work, you have the platform for the player to play. Why don't we meet in the middle and say, if he hits these targets, he should be entitled to that. So what you now do is you create an environment for the player, especially if it's a young player, to work hard, to stay hungry, to stay focused, met by bonuses every single time he does that. And from a club's perspective, what do? You have a player that is still going to be hungry, he's still going to be determined, he's still going to be focused, he still wants to be at that club, because why does a club lose a player? A club loses a player for two reasons, right? One more so than the other. Somebody next door is going to pay him more money. So therefore, if that player feels undervalued, going back to the scenario that you've just explained, that player, I can guarantee you, he feels undervalued right now. Okay? So therefore, all he needs is just a whisper in his ear for him to go, well, if you go down to the club down the road, they're going to give you that bonus as standard. That's life-changing money to him. So he's going to, whether he likes it or wants to or not, he has to look at it because it's a job at the end of the day. And I think this is where a lot of people that's outside the game get confused because they see, the big salary headlines, but what you got to remember is that even if you and I worked at, just say for example, anywhere, we could just say we worked at a normal 9 to 5 and we was getting paid X. If the store down the road is going to pay you double that, you're going to go and have a look at it because it's a job at the end of the day.
Absolutely, yeah.
And football is no different. And I think when you're entering into a contract, especially for a football contract, you've got to make sure that, you're very strong with it. And that's where people like yourselves will come into it, Manish, because if I'm going in as a football representative and as an agent, doing a deal with a club, it carries more weight if you guys as lawyers will come in and say, well, wait a minute, we've read this contract, we've explained it to the family, but we believe, along with his agent, that this contract is not reflective of the player's ability and potential.
Yeah.
Now, we're not going to sign this contract because there's no clause that says we have to sign it. But until you make this contract right for us that we think is fair, then we can enter into that.
I think you're right. I think one of the things I wanted to just add to that is that everything that Eddie said reflects the experience of someone who's in the market, who understands the club. You've worked with players, you've been through the system, you know how the one angle to this, which will be a whole separate podcast, is about the intermediary system. The football agents world is completely deregulated. So people who are coming in and looking at these agreements
you don't have a trade eye for it.
Exactly.
You don't have a trade eye for it. So all you see essentially, guys, is that player A is going to club X. And what happens in the middle? Well, if you're not a professional in that space, you will never know the answer to that. Because you can go from playing non-league football to playing in the Premier League. But when you're in the Premier League, it comes with a whole new world, a whole new set of problems, a whole new expectation, a whole new, just a whole new existence for you as an individual because you're into a new space now that you've never been before. And that comes with so much pressure and that comes with so much people pulling at you left, right and centre. So therefore, if you're going into it, going back to what you're saying, you got now is deregulated. So you've got people that have no idea about football making big multi-million pound decisions based on what?
Yeah.
Nothing really.
And at the end of the day, Mo, just for the avoidance of doubt, supposing you've got a situation, go back to that example that you talked about earlier on, where something contractually is not where the player thought he was going to be.
Yeah.
Can you just not simply file an amended contract
Which was
and
that
go
simple.
to the Football League or the Premier League and say, actually, look, we got it wrong, hands up, here's the corrected version. Can we just pretend that was the one that sort of stuck all along?
I mean, the answer is no, really, because most of these agreements have anti-variation clauses in them. So
And that's the reason.
So-
That's what I wanted to tease out.
yeah, so I mean, most of this stuff, you can't vary it without all the parties agreeing in writing.
Yeah.
Some agreements can be done, but we've seen some agents have to come in either. I've seen some situations where we've had players who've been represented by agents who are not experts in that marketplace. And I purposely use that word, so marketplace is an ecosystem in itself.
Yeah.
And you need to have the knowledge and expertise in that world. Who've come in, not had CEOs rub their hands together because they've seen XYZ walk in. They've got the deal they wanted. Players then realise 6 months, a year down the line, be introduced to a new agent who's come along and actually taken that player on board. And because of the experience and connections that agent has, is able to go to the CEO and say, look, can we talk about something? But that only leverages on that agent's expertise. That's not a usual
That's
situation.
for a new deal completely.
For a new deal
and
completely.
it's not changing the terms and conditions of the previous one.
For new deal complete. So that's the only way that I've ever seen some elements being looked at.
Yeah.
I mean, again, this all depends on who it is, the relationships, what you're looking to get out of it, how well the player is performing. I mean, ultimately, this comes down to performance.
I think you're spot on there, and I've had a situation like that before, a few times now, and we had a player who was playing for a massive club, massive club, regular in European competitions. But then you look at the contract. He wasn't with me at the time. I came to sign him after he had moved to the club, to realise that the contract he was on, after winning the league title twice before that, League Cup twice, come to realise that this player that's played almost 200 games for this club is effectively sitting on a youth team contract.
Wow.
He's effectively sitting on a youth team contract, and the chairman knows this.
Yeah.
But what the chairman's saying to himself is that we've got a top asset here. He's playing week in, week out. He's at the top of his game, and we are paying him peanuts for it. So it wasn't until that point where we sat down and we said, right, where are we? And I actually saw the contract he was on, and it was like, okay, that's your son's contract, now get me your contract. It was like, no, that's my contract. So you're playing in Europe against Barcelona, AC Milan, winning titles, and you're earning this contract. So for me, that was, from my background, I took that quite personally, because I almost saw it as the club taking an advantage of a situation. And don't forget, like I said, clubs have been around for hundreds of years, and that's how they exist, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
So it wasn't until we went into the meeting with the chairman and the player, and we basically said, well, look, something's wrong here. This player is dramatically wrong here. And the chairman stood by his guns, if you like. Then he realised that, okay, well, I'm actually sat in a room with someone that knows what he's talking about. And for me, it was a very simple conversation. If we don't change this contract to reflect what he should be on, in line with what everybody else is on, it's quite simple. We will not sign another contract. And the chairman knew of me and my reputation. So it was a case of, if you don't do it, it's fine. His contract will run out next season. So what will we do? We will just have a look and see who's going to give him what he deserves. And that's what it is for me. It's not about getting more than what you deserve, but get what you deserve. And I think with that said, the chairman gave him a new deal. The player couldn't believe it. And, he was very, very well off after that. But he played 2 years undervalued, underpaid, and he had no idea, because the guy that brought him over did not know the marketplace, did not know the ecosystem.
And I think that leads us into a question I do want to get into with Mo.
Sure.
And that is of the value of the representation agreements.
Yes.
So if a player is completely unhappy with the services being provided by his agents and wants to jump ship, find someone else that does all the great things that Ed's just talked about, what are his options?
Limited, I think, is probably the best way to explain that. I'll give you some examples of what we've dealt over the summer. Many players have contacted us to see how they can get out of their representation contracts with
There's a standard 2-year deal, aren't
There's
they?
a standard 2-year deal, representation contract. The FA has a template agreement on their website that any intermediary can use. It has its holes in it, in the sense that it may not achieve completely what an agent would want it to achieve. But the thing that it does do is tie in a player for 2 years. Now, I'm currently dealing with a case at the moment with a player who wants to leave his agent. The relationship has truly broken down. And this guy was a family friend, and it has, it's got wider impact than people realise. It's not a recruiter trying to do a job for you. It's completely toxic, and it's difficult. You can't really get out of it. The only way you can get out of it is if the intermediary lapses in his registration and more than 14 days go by, or we have an issue with looking at what kind of representations were provided to the player when he entered into the intermediary representation contract.
The player just can't turn around and say, actually, I've got a bit of a wrong in here, or someone who is at the lower end of the skill chain. I want to upsource and upskill to get the right support that I deserve, given my skill as a player. That's no sort of...
No. And I think there's two factors to that. There's two factors to that, really. That agent, usually, when they... Ed will chip in here, but when a player is thinking about moving somewhere else. Sure. He doesn't respond to your WhatsApps, he won't pick up the phone calls. It's classic case, head is turned. Yeah. So there is and they try and force it through, and it can rebuff back on them quite badly. And actually, when we've acted for agencies and players looking to leave the agency, a player that sends a letter that looks very much like it's been drafted by a lawyer, unfortunately, because it hasn't been well advised, actually places that player in breach of the regulations itself, because more likely than not that indicates that they've had conversations with other agents, which is a breach of the regulations. So we tend to throw that back to
It's what we know in the business as tapping up.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
I mean, it's prevalent in the game. I'm not gonna lie and say it isn't, but the regulations are there for a reason, and my job is to interpret them for what they are, and it's pretty strict in terms of its interpretation.
So how would you get around that situation then? If the player wants to go and an agent wants to keep him, and he's entitled to keep him.
Yeah. So I can explain. I can give you an example of something we dealt with over the summer. So we're dealing with a Premier League player who head was turned. The father of the player had conversations with another agency on behalf of his son, and my client was the agent. And to be fair, my clients were very they accepted the fact that his head had turned. They knew that he wasn't going to get him back. The player had engaged another law firm, a sports law firm, to send a letter, and the arguments they used were pretty much something that we see quite regularly, that when we entered into this representation contract with a player, we promised a number of certain things, and it was in reliance of those promises that we entered into those contracts. And there is a contractual avenue for you to say that there was a misrepresentation and then something called a repudiatory breach of contract. So you can kind of take it back and terminate a contract immediately. And they can throw all of these things. Okay. And essentially, it's a 6-page legal letter throwing as much as you can at the wall and seeing what sticks. And 80 to 90% of the time, most agents won't go to a lawyer to discuss it because they think, one, we can be expensive to look at a letter and give initial advice, which isn't always the case. But two, they kind of think, well, it's not worth the trouble. And so in that instance, my client came to us and we were able to fend it off. But it meant that we had to come to the table with the other agency. And what tends to happen quite a lot in the football world, which I don't think many people are aware of, that lots of settlements happen between agents. People pay off their agent, or the player will pay off their agent, using the money may come from another agency, but there's a settlement agreement in place to terminate that contract. So it can be done by mutual termination, which is a way that we can kind of players can get out of their deals. But I think that's kind of the avenues are very limited, and it's all dependent on factors and the relationship and the context.
And one presumes, Mo, that the matters we've just been talking about in relation to the club contract carry over into endorsement contracts as well. Yeah. Because there was an article I was reading recently, and this was a player whose agent had secured him a boot deal, and the agent had sold it to the player. You've got a boot deal that's going to produce £500,000 of income per year, but that was the headline rate. When you get into the detail, all this was contingent upon international appearances for his country and club appearances as well. And by the time you sort of factor all that in, the drop down and the scaling down
and probably how many times that player will appear on TV as well.
All of this, and the scaling down effect was so dramatic that the player's like, well, I'm a million miles away from where I thought I was. So again, for the sake of, I'm not going to put you on the spot in terms of what your fee might be to look at these things, but in terms of managing expectations and getting the right answer,
sure,
spending a little bit of money on some legal fees, surely is at the end of the world.
Well, it's a very similar case that you'll make for your clients, but I think from my perspective, endorsement deals, and predominantly we look at boot deals that you touched upon, and very interesting way that they are set up, and I think most people don't really realise how closely linked they are to the performance element. And we've seen boot deals which will the player has to play a certain percentage of the games. If he drops below playing a certain percentage of the games, then there's a reduction in the fee. If he's injured, then there's a reduction in the fee. If he does something which they, in how they deem it, not to kind of be compatible with their brand guidelines, there's a reduction in the fee. And also, I think also people wouldn't really tend to understand how these boot deals are kind of structured. As you said, I mean, they're split payments across a period of time, and they also can transcend when a player moves from one club to another.
Yeah.
So if you're going from, say, and these agreements are pegged on the levels of categories of the club. So you've got a Category 1 club, such as like Manchester United, and if you then go to Sunderland, as an example, there will be a far lower category, and as a result, your retainer fee will be far lower. And I think that's not actually ever explained to a player, because they tend to think, oh, I've got that, and that's going to be every year I'm going to get an X amount. So we see lots of issues with, I mean, the major issues at the moment with boot deals have been around the whole matching kind of clauses. So towards the end of these boot deals, the brand has the ability to renew the deal, and they normally give 3 to 6 months that they can kind of put an offer, and 1 or 2 months before a deal will be done with the agent more often than not. But we've seen issues in the past. Mesut Ozil, for example, had a big issue with his supplier at the time. I think he was with Nike, and he wanted to go to Adidas, and there was Nike had argued they had matched the deal. Mesut Ozil wanted to move, and it went to court, and I think like the Dutch court ruled in Nike's favour. So these things can get really, quite hotly disputed. In terms of matching clause, we've seen that really relevant recently with the football club in New Balance, who relied particularly on looking at a matching clause and how that can be structured. Very similar premise in terms of can you match the offer of a new brand coming in and providing similar terms. I think the key for boot deals and players and agents to think about is brand consistency. So brands are trying to achieve this level of consistency where if you take Kylian Mbappe, who plays for Paris Saint-Germain, PSG are sponsored by Nike, the French Football Federation are sponsored by Nike, so it's really nice and easy for them. It's nice and easy for Kylian's agent to go to another club that is also sponsored by Nike.
Because sometimes in the past they can influence that deal. I remember the Brazilian squad had the same type of deal, didn't they? Back, I think it was in the World Cup '98, where all the Brazilians players had to wear Nike boots as a part of their deal, and they always went to clubs more often than not that share the same Nike kit deal as well. So it made it easier. It was almost like what some people call 360 deal, because the deal you almost sign to them for a lifetime, and it's easier for that transaction to happen. Because if, for example, I know there was rumours of Lionel Messi coming to Manchester City, for example, and City at the time were Nike, Messi's Adidas. So for him to come, Adidas was going to say, well, because we've got him on a 360 lifetime deal, he would have to come over to, Man City would have to come over to Adidas for us to make the deal happen, because he's going to cost about $500 million just on the transfer fee alone. So it makes sense for them to keep their branding all together.
Yeah, and you see that not just with the boot deals, but you see it with looking at when you've got an agent dealing with a player, thinking about endorsements generally. What is there? We always kind of look at what is the brand portfolio, what is the brand equity, how do we kind of make sure that we've got this element of brand consistency. And you've seen other examples which are not related to the boot deals, but you had Zlatan Ibrahimovic, who went to Manchester United, but he wasn't able to participate in Chevrolet's deals because he had another deal with a very well-known Swedish car manufacturer. And that exclusivity meant they couldn't leverage their partnership with Chevrolet with Zlatan, and he's obviously the image and
an iconic
character. So I think they tend to play a big part of the conversation when you get to very elite players. We're talking the Pogbas, the Ronaldos of the world. For most players, the boot deal is is a good source of endorsement, and I think it's just about making sure the devil, as we've already kind of established, is in the detail. So it's really understanding what's the lowest they could achieve in a year and what's the highest they could achieve in a year, and understanding how that could work, and making sure that whatever has been agreed between the agent and the brand is actually reflected in that deal. We see a lot of things they would have said, we've agreed that, that should have come out, or that should have been in, not being really reflected in boot deals. So that more often than not.
Brilliant. One of the other areas I wanted to get into with you, Mo, and we'll be touching on insurance issues for professional sports people in another podcast. But one of the things I think we'll be talking there is sort of driving offences.
Yes.
Which not just professional sports people, but most people, from time to time in their life, are guilty of. Whether that be going through a red light, speeding, drink driving, playing around on their phones whilst they're actually driving, social media. What sort of legal support can you and your colleagues at Mackrell's offer someone who suddenly gets the blue lights in their rearview mirror?
Well, I think we obviously we've got our own crime department, so we can help directly with the offence itself. The thing that we tend to see, and Ed and Pete, you'll both know this from the young players that you have, the phone is never far from their hand. And unfortunately, you will see things on Instagram stories or a Twitter post about them filming themselves whilst they're driving or whilst they're out on a night out. So it's very easy for them to become, target cases for the enforcement authorities.
Yeah.
And I think from our perspective, what we tend to do is we try and educate the clients we work with, we try and educate the agencies we work with. So Pete and we both share that big educational focus.
Yeah.
And we always believe, we have to. It's not just about the legal and financial world. It's about the life skills you need as a human being in the kind of bubble that they're in, to deal with all the circumstances that may come across their table. And I think for us, it's about providing quite a holistic level of service. So we go to the realms of for social media deals and their endorsement levels. We go to the basic element of any deals they sign up to. We create like a separate crib sheet which has do's and don'ts, which is I think very helpful. They get it on a PDF on their WhatsApp, so they know what's happening.
Close to it, yeah.
They're close to it, and it means that we can kind of easily digest a contract, but it also means that we'll ensure the agent, the social media agency, if there is one, we work with them to ensure they've got full visibility on what we can and cannot say, because it has a wider impact than just potentially them personally. As big as that will be, from a drink driving offence or anything criminal related, one tweet can lose you a significant amount of money.
And I think from a player's perspective, what I've seen over the years as well is that I think they know drink driving is wrong. They know texting and tweeting on their phone is wrong. But I think they're in such a bubble at times, right? They're in such a bubble at times. I'm going to be brutally honest. They're in such a bubble at times. They feel that laws that apply to you and I doesn't apply to them.
Agreed.
Because they are this type of superhero, if you want. They have this superhero status. They live this superhuman life. And they feel they can get away with things more than what we would. But like I always say to my players and people that I worked with before, it's quite the opposite. You are more of a target because when you get them blues and twos pulled up behind you, you're going to be the conversation for the next month, 6 months, because whoever's pulled you over is going to really enjoy and love that fact that they pulled such and such over. And this is what I done to such and such, I mean, I had again, I won't mention any names, but I had a friend that top player, top athlete. I mean, he played at the highest level for a club that I think you know quite well, Pete. And he went out the night before and stayed in the hotel, got up in the morning, going home, and he got pulled over. So obviously he still had alcohol in his system, but not to the level where he got into the car and drove. He, head down. 12 hours later, he's up and he's got home. But him getting pulled over, all the policeman wanted to do was to ask him about, or to say, you are such and such, and I'm gonna get you done. Because guess who I support? I support the team that you guys hate. So for him, it was a badge of honour, so to speak, pardon the pun, but it was like a badge of honour. Knowing that he pulled it, and footballers and athletes are very, very much susceptible to that more than I would say you and I, because if we get pulled over, we're just Eddie and Peter. No, we don't really care. But if the David Beckham gets pulled over, guess what? That guy probably won't have to buy a drink again in his local pub for the next 6 months, because there's a story there to tell. So, do you know what I mean? It's a weird situation.
I think it's spot on. I think our biggest kind of philosophy really is just stay in the back pages, don't stay in the front pages, really. And we try and, but it is difficult. I mean, we're dealing with young athletes playing at a high level who are, as you said, sporting heroes for many people around the country, many people who are much older than them and far younger than them, but at the same time, and they're on a huge amount of money a week, which gives the feeling and impression that they can pay their way out of something. Yeah. Which, you know, Pete, I'm sure you would have come across your table many a time.
Not personally, but
we see this, and for us, it's kind of a case of trying to provide the legal services, but also very much keeping in mind like this whole holistic feel and working with the other stakeholders around them, working with other people around them. We kind of we would work with Ed and we'd work with UP and say, like, actually, how can we help them more? And that goes beyond the kind of the remit of what someone may envisage as a sports lawyer.
Yeah.
One of the things that strikes me is that sometimes a player, having committed a traffic offence, for example, gets the letter from the DVLA coming through the normal system and arrives on his doormat, doesn't open his post.
Yeah.
Is that something that, is it just me, or is this something that you've encountered as well?
I see this all the time. I think some of them don't even know where the post is sent, and it's only until they've got a number of brown letters, until they open the last one, that they realise they've missed months of correspondence. And it's actually, having someone to, and unfortunately, it falls into something we were talking about before, about this bubble, that at top teams, top players, everything is done for them. More often than not, their bags are sent ahead before they travel internationally. They give their passports into someone who's going to make sure they don't forget their passport when they travel abroad. They have someone to literally do anything around them. The one thing that they tend to sometimes forget is they can't control Royal Mail, so they don't know what falls in their postbox, and they don't know what postbox they're attributed to sometimes. So it's not just you. I think we see it quite a lot, and unfortunately, that in itself causes huge issues, because we're going back to these authorities to say we didn't look at we haven't seen the correspondence, and whilst that might be a genuine reason, because the player is just not bothered to read it, you can imagine that argument doesn't fly very well, because most people would probably pull that one. Yeah. So I think for us,
I must say, I think from a player's perspective, I don't think they intentionally go out their way not to read it.
No, I agree.
I think they're so far removed from reality at times, is that they feel that, oh well, I can pay that next week, and that next week never comes round, and that's why you find yourself going back and saying, sorry, you didn't see it. So I think it's through my experience, it's about saying, listen, this is what's going to happen. You have to be in charge of this. You have to deal with this, and I think it makes your job so much more difficult when a letter doesn't get open, because now that same letter that could have cost him 50 quid is now costing $5,000. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah.
But it's a painful lesson, but it's a lesson that I believe that a player or an athlete, a young athlete or an athlete needs to have in order for him to understand that you are touchable. This is reality. And I think sometimes they lose that, because like you said, they get everything done for them ahead of time. As a player, you're told when to get up, what to eat, what time you got to train, what time you got to go to bed. Everything, it's very, very limited, the things you do for yourself, so again, is this about understanding what happens outside, that training ground? And I think a lot of players do not know how to do it, because, they've been in that environment so long, they've forgotten how to be
I agree with that massively.
themselves, so
In which case it's dependent presumably upon the professional advisor to get that close to the client. They actually pass correspondence across as a matter of course, or indeed I've got a pattern established with several players, and I will periodically go and see them every 8, 10, 12 weeks to go through some tax planning, some financial stuff and wealth planning, but also to sit there and open their post with them and say to them, this is what needs to happen next.
Yeah, I mean that's
you sort of nip it in the bud. You catch it before it becomes a major problem.
Yeah, I think that's the difference with maybe other advisors in our sport, in our sector actually, that we have to be as I said, very proactive in trying to kind of not be reactive later on down the line, because we know exactly what that leads to. So I can totally sympathise with opening posts with clients, which is probably very unusual for most people to think about.
And that concludes our episode today on legal matters pertaining to contractual reviews and driving offences. Thank you, Mo, for your input today. Very valuable. I've certainly learned plenty. And thank you to Ed Dua for your contributions, and of course our listeners for tuning in. All references and links spoken about in this episode can be found in the episode show notes. Never miss an episode. Please subscribe to our show, and if you haven't already done so, please rate and review us in the App Store. Until next time, thank you for listening.
This S&W The Pulse podcast is of general nature and is not a substitute for professional advice. No responsibility can be accepted for the consequences of any action taken or refrained from as a result of what is said. The views expressed are not necessarily those of the presenter or of Smith & Williamson or any of its affiliates. No reproduction of this podcast may be made in whole or in part for professional or recreational purposes. No action should be taken based on this podcast, and we accept no liability if we change your views on any of the subjects mentioned.